we're here. We're in the end game now. I took a nap earlier, so I'm wide awake. I figured we could. I was gonna watch something, and I figured maybe we could watch it together. Let's do it.
Everything we know about Carmelita Torres is from a few newspaper accounts in 1917. They called her an auburn-haired Amazon, just 17 years old. She led...
This is also a dual purpose because I'm testing out my stream setup.
In anti-American rioting and shut down the US-Mexico border. But hidden within her story is something much bigger than a single riot. It's a story about American paranoia at the border, about a toxic campaign of disinfection and discrimination, and a US practice that would go on to inspire Nazi scientists.
Okay, so this is exactly why I'm watching this, actually. In the early sorry, loud AC. In the early 21st century, this happened, and I have a vague understanding of it, and I know that it happened, but I'm not super familiar with the details. And I'm from Texas, so a lot of this happened in the area that I live in, or around the area that I live in, or areas that I'm familiar with, I guess. And so I thought it would be useful, if not, incredibly, I don't know, prescient, considering the time that we're in now, to watch this and learn a little bit. So let's go. And yes, I'm drinking at 4 o'clock in the morning.
At the border between El Paso, Texas and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, thousands of people cross back and forth for work and school every day. They line up in Juarez and often wait for hours to get through the US checkpoint. But the border didn't always look like this.
Crossing this border used to be free and unrestricted. People would come and go without a passport. But after 1917, Juarez and El Paso became two separate communities.
It was a turbulent year at the border. The Mexican Revolution was ongoing, and the US was about to enter World War I.
All of a sudden, you have the war hysteria created by World War I. People here in El Paso that are deadly afraid that the Germans are going to attack from Ciudad Juarez.
Does this sound familiar? This fear-mongering about how our international enemy is somehow going to end up invading our country through our southern border. Something to think about.
The fear of invasion brought tensions to the border, while across the US, a different movement was gaining strength. The eugenics movement, based on junk science, aimed to create a genetically and morally superior population. That meant stricter controls on immigration, only allowing those deemed fit to enter. On Ellis Island, one of the busiest ports of entry at the time, US health officials were tasked with weeding out immigrants they thought were unfit or disease carriers. And across the country, that process coincided with the stereotyping of Mexicans as inferior and unclean. Dozens of film titles included the word greaser, a derogatory term used to describe Mexicans. This racist sentiment was strong at the US-Mexico border. El Paso's mayor...
Just a quick thought while it's on my mind. This is not that long ago. I mean, there are videos. There are movies being made. This is not that long ago.
Lee had developed an obsession with cleanliness, and it defined.
I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that happens for people with like slavery, because there's really no way for us to, I guess, see it happening in real time. But like, there's plenty of video evidence and contemporary writing and stuff.
Behind his political platform.
This obsession.
Contemporaneous.
Not only racial purity, but physical purity. He was going to literally clean up El Paso from all these bad elements. And by bad elements, he often meant racially bad elements.
One of Mayor Lee's biggest fears was a disease called typhus, spread by lice. So, under the pretense of sanitary betterment work, he helped lead a campaign to inspect every house in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. If the inspectors found lice, occupants were forced to take vinegar and kerosene baths, have their heads shaved, and clothing burned. Hundreds of homes were eventually destroyed. Lee also expanded the supposed health measures to include inmates in the El Paso jail.
They had to strip naked, take a bath inside a tub full of kerosene, and on one occasion, it seems somebody lit a match.
27 prisoners, majority Mexican or Mexican American, burned to death in the fire that the newspapers called the jail Holocaust. But
very fitting, because and I don't know if they're going to get to this or not, but very, very fitting. If you look at some of Hitler's early writings and the early writings of prominent Nazis and the research that they were doing in order to carry out the final solution, there are direct references to the cleansing camps that were at the border here.
But despite the tragic fire, Mayor Lee pushed forward with even more aggressive plans.
He sends a telegram, a Western Union telegram, to Rupert Blue, who was the Surgeon General up in Washington, D.C. And basically, well, let me just read it. Hundreds dirty, lousy, destitute Mexicans arriving at El Paso daily will undoubtedly bring and spread typhus unless a quarantine is placed at once.
The government didn't agree to a full quarantine because evidence suggested that typhus wasn't a major threat in the area. But instead, they funded a new disinfection plant at the border in 1916. In this facility, every immigrant considered a second-class citizen had to strip naked. Their clothes were sent to a large steam dryer and then fumigated with toxic pesticides inside the gas room.
Literally a gas chamber.
Would check each person's body, including private parts, for lice. If they found lice, immigrants would have to shave their head and body hair and bathe in a mix of kerosene and vinegar. Some even had their eyelids checked for things like pink eye, and many had to complete puzzles or simple IQ tests to prove that they were fit for entry. After this process, they'd receive a ticket as proof that they were disinfected, but they would need to go through this every 8 days in order to re-enter the U.S.
So many people didn't speak about it. They didn't talk about this humiliating process. Like, they kind of internalized it. It's that psychology of shame.
The toxic baths and dehumanizing inspections at the border set the stage for a revolt, led by the 17-year-old maid from Juarez who defied the order to bathe.
Carmelita Torres was, I've compared her to the Rosa Parks of the border. In the morning of January 28th, 1917, there's this electric trolley full of mostly women that are crossing every day. She convinces the majority, if not all, the women in that trolley to just say no and to refuse. They start a spontaneous protest.
Can you imagine?
There are accounts that in addition to the humiliating delousing procedures, for women, there was also sexual humiliation.
No.
There were rumors that, when they entered the plant.
It's almost like when you put law enforcement in charge of public health issues, the outcome is bad.
And then they were told to strip. Officers were taking their photos and then posting them in bars. So I can't even imagine the kind of feeling, like the feelings of violation and the feelings of, outrage.
She was called an instigator, a ringleader, but she was just a young woman that was just sick of the injustice, of the humiliation.
Like I said,
other women had gone
relevant.
through.
What started with just 200 protesters that morning slowly grew to a crowd of 2,000. Reporters said the scene reminded one of bees swarming. The hands of the feminine mob would claw at the tops of the passing cars. When the American officers tried to disperse the crowd, they were met with bottles, rocks, and insults. Protesters even laid down on the tracks.
Do you see what I meant yesterday by what law enforcement has largely been used for in the history of this country? That's not to say, obviously, that there isn't a place for law enforcement in a nation of 350 million people. Of course there is. But largely, this is the shit that law enforcement was doing when we came up with it. Before this, catching slaves. Then this, actual Nazi shit. And then union busting and cracking the heads of workers that just wanted some decent conditions and pay.
In front of the trolley cars to create a blockade. They were joined
Or didn't want their 7-year-old to work in a mine.
by men in what's called the Bath Riots, and they shut down this border for 2 days.
And then all you hear is that the ringleaders are arrested, and a few of the men are publicly executed.
As for Carmelita Torres,
God.
It appears like she was thrown in prison, and as historians, we don't know what happened to her afterwards. We've lost every trace.
Wow.
the fumigations didn't stop after the riots. In 1917 alone, over 100,000 Mexicans were deloused at the border. That same year, an immigration law made border procedures even more rigid. Immigrants at all points of entry needed to have a passport, take a literacy test, and many would have to pay an $8 head tax. And later that year, the U.S. Public Health Service laid down instructions.
Hold on. How much was $8 in 1917? $161?
Border agents about who should be kept out of the country.
Imbeciles, idiots, feeble-minded persons, physical defectives, persons afflicted with loathsome or dangerous contagious diseases.
The discriminatory policies at the border resembled horrific events elsewhere in the world.
No.
In
You don't
fact, while
say.
researching this, David stumbled upon a detail. The fumigation of Mexican immigrants wasn't just reminiscent of Nazi Germany, it was directly linked to it.
It's not so much that the United States was copying Nazi Germany, it's the opposite. Nazi Germany was copying the United States.
He found that in the 1920s, the US started using Zyklon B, an extremely poisonous acid.
If that stands out to you, it should. Zyklon B, used in the gas chambers in Auschwitz.
Gas to fumigate clothing at the border. And in 1937, in a German pest science journal, a scientist called for the use of Zyklon B in Nazi disinfection chambers. He included 2 photos of El Paso's delousing chambers as an example of how effective Zyklon B had been at the U.S. border to
Like
kill
I said,
unwanted pests.
Like I said,
The same scientist
Nazi
also
literature,
used to disinfect concentration
incredibly
camps. Eventually, it was
illustrative of the stuff that was going on.
to murder millions of people.
People, rightly so, say you can't compare what happened in Nazi Germany with other parts of the world. And that's true. In terms of Zyklon B, it was used on the border not to intentionally kill Mexican border crossers.
Right. But it's that age-old argument of like Hitler wasn't really an anti-Semite, right? Like it was all just he knew that like being anti-Semitic was politically beneficial for him. But that doesn't matter because the end game ended up being the same.
But the history of something like the Holocaust doesn't take place in a vacuum.
A few decades after the Bath riots, Mexico started sending men to work on U.S. farms and railroads as part of a new labor agreement called the Bracero Program. And through the program, the border disinfections continued.
Here in this facility, some migrants were sprayed with insecticides.
This time, it was a substance called DDT.
Jesus! Jesus!
A toxic pesticide which decades later would be banned for agricultural use by most developed countries.
Repeated contact must be avoided.
They were sprayed in the face.
So they just sprayed these people with Roundup. With like an old school Roundup.
They were sprayed in their private parts. And, they were stripped naked and inspected. And sometimes they're inspected like you would inspect livestock.
First-hand accounts from immigrants in the program reveal how little they knew about the fumigations.
So they talk about how humiliating it was, about why do they think we're so dirty? They'll call it the white powder. I don't know if they necessarily were told we're spraying you with DDT, but they'll call it el polvo, the powder.
A miraculous white powder that is helping to win the war against disease.
Now look, here's the thing, right? As a society, we were pretty moronic at the time as far as what the scientific outcomes were going to be from using these materials, obviously, right? I mean, the same thing can be said about our use of our societal like addiction to cigarettes, right? But it doesn't make the outcome any different. It doesn't make the there are so many things that were done to people in American history that, like, really? You're not gonna, like, you're not even gonna acknowledge that this happened? You're not even gonna teach people that this happened? I have to find a Vox video on YouTube with 2.2 million views to know that we did this?
Many of the employees who worked in the facilities weren't.
Because here's the thing, there are plenty of countries out there with, like, shit past that have done bad things and that have, like, been racist or done concentration camps and shit, right? But in most of those countries, their society knows about it on the whole, and I don't feel like that's the case in America.
Weren't given many details either.
When I first started, my role was a clerk. I got the job mainly because I spoke Spanish.
Holy shit! Dude, she was there. She's not that old. Look at this lady. She was there. This was not that long ago.
My role was a clerk. I got the job mainly because I spoke Spanish. There was a hut in the area when they came in from the Mexican side that they would go in there, and they had some sort of, it was for lice, they said. It was, to disinfect for lice. And we never gave it much thought, but we did think, sort of like what the Nazis used to do, to the Jews.
I had heard
these people are alive.
That they would spray them.
Walking among
and
us.
Sometimes there were comments from the men themselves that they would put a hose to them. I don't know if they knew what they were doing to them. I certainly didn't. It was far-fetched from the world we lived in.
It wasn't until the 1960s, when the Bracero program ended, that health authorities acknowledged the chemicals were dangerous and the baths and fumigations were finally discontinued.
You want history to be about progress, about everybody realizes how horrible it is, and then it stops. Unfortunately,
here's the thing, right? And this might be a little bit outside of the box of this particular video, but like, as human beings, there is a certain amount, American or otherwise, there is a certain amount of like trial and error that goes into this shit, right? I mean, you got to imagine that there were thousands of years where we just killed each other, kind of willy-nilly and just for whatever reason. You stole the saber-toothed tiger that I killed yesterday. Now I gotta pound your head in with a rock, right? So you gotta imagine that, yes, of course, as a species, there's going to be just like growth over time of like, well, this is things that we shouldn't do. But the thing that separates us from monkeys in being able to overcome those things is that we can internalize and teach each other, and in a multi-generational way teach people about what happened, so that further along in the evolutionary chain, whether that's from generation to generation or hundreds of years apart, we can teach people about this kind of stuff. And that's literally what separates us from wild animals, is that we can make the point to people that like, hey, this happened and it was bad, and so let's not do that again because a lot of people died. And so we can mitigate a lot of human suffering if we just know that this happened and keep people from doing it. And the breakdown of our education system in this country specifically, but even all over the world, and the small amount of importance that we put on that in most modern societies is leading to our downfall, right?
That's how it works in movies, but this was the border, right? And in the border, a lot of things never become resolved. They just keep on repeating themselves.
Decades after the disinfection campaign ended, the language, the strategy, and the dehumanizing politics of fear and exclusion still linger.
It's a health issue too, because we don't know what people have coming in here.
They're coming in with
boom. Fucking boom. Yes. Exactly. This is still an argument that is being made about the border and the people who are coming here to do jobs that, let's remember, Americans largely will not do.
Diseases such as smallpox and leprosy and TB that are going to affect our people in the United
Former ICE agent.
States. It's just a fact. You're going to see disease outbreak.
Apprehensions in the El Paso area specifically have spiked more than 600%.
They are essentially being warehoused, as many as 300 children in a cell.
Without adequate food, water, and sanitation.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border.
I don't like anything compared to the Holocaust.
But also why can't you compare
it, his practices, to what led up to the Holocaust? Do we have to wait for the act?
Can we just agree that Joy Behar
to a Holocaust?
I mean, look at her. Can we just agree that Joy Behar is pretty hammered every time she films this show?
Before we...
I mean, you would have to be, right? Because God bless, it's just I don't know if you've ever watched a full episode of this show, but Jesus Christ, it's just designed to melt your brain.
Speak out.
At the border between Juarez and El Paso, the same space where the bath riots once happened, hundreds of migrants have been huddled in makeshift detention centers. They've been waiting to find out if the U.S. government deems them fit for entry.
I mean, bro, come on. Come on. Like, these people are living... Children are living out... I mean, look at that. Like, what is your excuse for this? What is your reasoning for this?
As always, there's so much information that we couldn't fit in this video, but I wanted to leave you guys...
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I mean, that was 100 years ago, right? I mean, that was 100 years ago that we put these people in gas chambers and we gassed them. Now, granted, we didn't gas them to death, but we still exposed them to insane chemicals and shit, and we didn't provide material changes to their life or their living conditions so that they weren't in these unhealthy situations. Nah, fuck that. We just demonized them and, like, checked their balls for lice. on a mass scale. Jesus. All right, let's go to the next one. Come on. We're on a roll.
I was adopted by a white missionary couple.
I was adopted.
Immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years. They were white.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
they took the idea that they were saving me.
Saving us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us. And to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the US found a new solution to absorb and assimilate them.
So here's the thing, right? The entire concept of America has been built on this manifest destiny reality that kind of came to light in the 1800s, right? Which was, if it's there, it is for the righteous to take. And so that got mutated into this form of capitalism that we have today, which is, I'm just going to, we can exponentially grow forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, amen, without any sort of consequences. That we can just continue to absorb the Earth's resources. We can continue to mine every possible natural resource across the planet, frack the shit out of everything, and extract the wealth and resources of every third world country on Earth with no consequences whatsoever. And that whole mindset, for Americans anyway, started with this manifest destiny and the eradication of the Native Americans and shit like that. We couldn't have just left well enough alone. The reality is, if there's enough room for everyone. Jesus!
It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms and basically ran an assimilation experiment. And then he took his results to the federal government and said, they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded.
In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever off-reservation boarding school for Native American children. His motto was to kill the Indian and save the man.
Oh, hold on. Hold the phone. Hold the phone. Hold it. Hold it. I'm not going to read that out loud, but just give it a little read there. It has been said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I say so too. Let us kill the Indian and save the man. Let us kill the inward with a hard R and save the man. Let us kill the white trash and save the man. Let us kill the offscorings of Europe and save the man. These are the Irish, the Eastern Europeans, and save the man. And they will come. Oh, jeez. If Christian America rises in her high destiny, These are the people being funded by the government
at the
time.
Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide, disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair was cut short. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their native languages.
To take our children and to indoctrinate them into...
Wait, hold on. Indian name Red Medicine, right? English name Cecil. They changed these people's names.
To take our children
Is there anything
and to
more
indoctrinate
dehumanizing than
them
changing people's
into
names?
Western society, to take away their identity as indigenous peoples, their tribal identity. I think it's one of the most effective and insidious ways that the U.S. did do harm to indigenous peoples here, because it targeted our children, our most vulnerable. And they tried to make us ashamed for being Indian, and they tried to make us something other than Indian.
There are also accounts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, of forced manual labor, neglect, starvation, and death.
My great-grandfather went to Carlisle, and nobody in my family ever talked about it. So if you Google Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you will see will be actually from Carlisle. Colonel Pratt created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was...
Bro, I mean, look at that. It is no wonder, right? It is very little wonder that Native American communities in this country have some of the highest rates of drug addiction, poverty, domestic abuse, alcoholism, petty crimes. I mean, look at that. On the left, right, you have a person steeped in their own culture, proud of their own community, with a sense of like, I'm not going to do things that hurt my community because I'm part of it. And on the right, you have someone who is completely alienated from how they were born, who they are, what their family is like. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? I mean, imagine, you know, and I know that I'm saying this as a white person, but imagine if, like, they did this to your grandfather. Or they did this to your father, even. I mean, this wasn't that long ago.
Was working, so it was, you know, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlisle model of education swept the country and led to the creation of over 350 boarding schools to assimilate Native American children.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen
again
a
video
white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly...
Does this remind anyone else of the scene in Get Out where they're like, we've come up with a new program to take your brain and put it in the brain, or put it in the body of a black person?
They brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism
Comparative savagery
to one of civilization.
Fuck.
In 1900, there were about 20,000 Native American children in these schools. By 1925, that number more than tripled. Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even camped outside to be close to them.
Oh my God.
Many students ran away. Some found ways to hold on to their languages and cultures. Others, though, could no longer communicate with family members. And some never returned home at all. Wow. By stripping the children of their Native American identities, the U.S. government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands, and that was part of the U.S. strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away to boarding schools, a number of U.S. policies infringed on their tribal lands back home. In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away.
The whole thing was purposeful. And the fact that it has been buried in the history books and not acknowledged is also intentional. And in fact, the same tactics were used in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. All of these countries have acknowledged, apologized, or reconciled in some way, except for the United States.
That's such an important point, right? And it comes up with the Nazis a lot, but it's true with the Aborigines in New Zealand and New Zealand and Australia as well. These places have reconciled, right? They have said, look, we did a bad thing, okay? We thought that we were doing the right thing, and that was, and not even we, but our grandparents, thought that they were doing the right thing for society as a whole, and they went and did this shit, and shit like this. And we have now grown as a society to understand that that's wrong. And that we did the wrong thing, and that was bad. To make up for that in some material way. And the United States is the only place that hasn't happened. I'll be right back.
Over time, the brutality of boarding schools started to surface. And after a 1928 report detailed the horrific conditions at some schools, many began to close. In the 1960s, indigenous activism rose alongside the civil rights movement. And by the 1970s, that activism forced more schools to shut down. The government handed over control of the remaining boarding schools to tribes to be run in partnership with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But just as the boarding school era started fading, another assimilation project took shape: adoption. The main goal of this pilot project was to stimulate the adoption of American Indian children to primarily non-Indian adoptive homes. They claimed it was to promote the adoption of the forgotten child, but it was essentially a continuation of the boarding school assimilation tactics. And the strategy came with a financial advantage for the government too. Adoption was cheaper than running boarding schools. But first, adoption officials
Capitalism at work, baby.
Had to sell white America on the idea of adopting Native American children. Feature stories like this one in Good Housekeeping marketed them to white families. They were described as unwanted, and adoption gave them a chance at new lives. In the end, their media campaign worked. White families wanted Indian adoption. But the problem was, many of these children were not orphans that nobody wanted. They were kids often ripped apart from families that wanted to keep them.
You still will hear stories today of people, my age, older, saying, I remember as a child, the social worker was coming and people would hide their children.
On reservations, social workers used catch-all phrases like child neglect or unfit parenting as evidence for removal. But their criteria was often questionable. Some accounts describe children being taken away for living with too many family members in the same household.
An extended family is a big thing for Native people, and that means being judged for being in a house that's overcrowded. So it's always whiteness is the standard for success, and everything else is judged by that standard.
Wow, that's an important point. That's a very important point.
By the 1960s, about 1 in 4 Native children were living apart from their families.
1 in 4?
The official Indian Adoption Project placed 395 Native American children into mostly white homes. But it was just one of many in an era of Native American adoptions. Other state agencies and private religious organizations began increasingly making placements for Native American children too.
And there's money in
My
it.
mother giving me up was a white person telling her if she didn't, she would never see her other kids again.
In one of the documents I have, it's addressed to my biological father, Victor Fox, that he was trying to look us up to get a hold of us. But Hennepin County wrote, Daniel and Douglas are adapting very well and their new family. Just was totally, it was a false statement.
Yeah, no shit.
When you're adopted, you know you're missing something. I think I've likened it to having like when someone has like a 500-piece puzzle and they have all the pieces to make this pretty picture except one.
My adoptive mother was not well, verbally, physically, and sexually, and spiritually abusive. So by the time I was 14, I started drinking. 15, drugs were added, and I became an addict to numb. I didn't realize I was numbing pain.
I tried suicide, tried slicing my wrist one time.
Children were taken and believed like I believed for a long time that there was something wrong with me versus something wrong with the system.
The Indian Adoption Project was considered a success by the people who set it in motion. Officials claimed, generally speaking, we believe the Indian people have accepted the adoption of their children by Caucasian families and have been pleased to learn the protection afforded these children. But the truth was unsettling.
These hearings on Indian children's welfare is now in session.
Well, I was pregnant with Bobby, and the welfare kept coming over there and asking me if I'd give him up for adoption.
Before he was even born?
Yeah.
They picked up my children and placed them in a foster home. And I think that they were abused in a foster home.
4 years after Native people organized in this Senate hearing, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, known as ICWA.
It gives tribes a place at the table in court.
States would be required to provide services to families to prevent removal of an Indian child. And in case removal was necessary, they would have to try to keep the child with extended family or another Native American family.
Without our relatives, we cease to exist. So with Native people, part of our wealth is in our family. It's in who we're connected to.
But the legacy of family separation in Native communities has been difficult to fully undo. Today, Native American children are 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care than white children, even when their families have similar presenting problems. In these cases, ICWA is often the best legal protection they have, and it's been under attack repeatedly.
A young girl ripped from her foster family because of the Indian Children Welfare Act.
White adoptive families intent on keeping Native American children have tried to do away with the act, and they're often backed by conservative organizations.
The Indian Child Welfare Act was dealt a blow earlier this month.
The subject of a lawsuit issued on Tuesday by the Goldwater Institute, arguing that preferences given to American Indian families to adopt Indian children is unconstitutional and discriminates based on race.
It's a way for these industries, these very powerful industries, to try to attack what Indian identity is.
Wanting to overturn ICWA is connected to everything about who we are as a nation. So if we don't have any protections for our families, and if we don't have protections for our treaties, then we have no more Indians.
We've been under attack, we're gonna continue to be under attack, and we have to just keep fighting.
It's in our DNA to survive.
We are nations that
only because we put them in that situation.
exist European contact, and we are still here.
European contact. Jesus Christ, man. I mean, just think about, like, your kids are taken away from you. They're raised by a community that's not your own. And then those kids have kids. And those kids have kids. And within 1 or 2 generations, man, like, you have no culture. You have no community. You have no one that looks like you around you. You have no one that shares your actual heritage around you. And you're expected to just automatically assimilate into a society that isn't your own? I mean, just unreal, man. Completely unreal. And like I said, some of the just worst, just nastiest shit that has ever happened in world history over the last 200 or 300 years has started here. And a lot of human suffering around the world and a lot of immiseration around the world could have been solved by teaching people about this shit, by making this information widely known, so that we could understand like the implications of this, the implementation of this sort of public policy, because that's what it is. This was public policy to gas Mexican people or to rehouse Native American children like they're pets or something. And I'm sure, right, that the vast majority of these kids that were rehoused were probably treated okay, you know, by the people who were adopting them. And that, on the whole, the people who were adopting them probably had the best intentions, right? But so what? Like, so what? These people were deprived of their family. They're deprived of their heritage. It's exactly the same reason that I talked about this yesterday. It's exactly the same reason that, like, black people in this country live in a colony within a nation. Like, you know, that's cheat code because I'm reading that book, but they live in a society that isn't their own, and they have no actual cultural heritage. The answer to this is, you have to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. You have to, and not just for black people, but for indigenous people also. And that includes Mexicans. Because you have to be able to go back and say, look, yes, this was done. And here, you know, like, people who live in this country should be able to go back into their family history and see what the hell happened to them. And they can't right now. And not only should they be able to do that, but they should also be able to exist in a society that gives them material repayment for the fact that we did this to them. It's just unbelievable, man. I mean, it's pretty insane to think about the fact that, like, this isn't taught to people. And if it was, they would be horrified, and we could maybe prevent some immiseration. Unbelievable. Just completely unbelievable. Insane. But I think tomorrow, if I can get it going, I think tomorrow we'll do, I think I'll finally fix my streaming issues, but knock on wood. I don't want to jinx it. Tomorrow we'll do, the Banana Wars, which, if you haven't heard of, amazing. I was at one point, around the time that Trump was, and Fox News and the Republican Party was fear-mongering about the caravan, the so-called caravan, I got into an argument with a family member of mine that, you know, all these people are coming here, and they're all, you know, bearing down on our southern border, and what are we going to do with these thousands of people that are going to come in here, right? And I made the point to him that a lot of the immiseration and a lot of the problems in these countries in Central and South America have a strong correlation with our foreign actions as a country, with the things that we have done as a society and the decisions that we have made from a government standpoint to create the circumstances where these people feel like they are being, or to create the circumstances where these people are actually under threat. And the Banana Wars is actually a very, very interesting example of how United States foreign policy led us down the road of these people having to come here for asylum. That the amount of violence and just insane exploitation that we have exported as a society to Central and South America in the last 150 years is the reason that these people now have to flee their governments. So we'll do that tomorrow, or today. But now I'm going to bed. So y'all have a good night, morning, day.